You know that moment when your entire world shifts with just one innocent comment from a child, when 7 words from your 6-year-old niece reveal that your own family has been living a lie for months? Well, that happened to me last Tuesday, and by Thursday, my parents were learning what real consequences look like. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm 32, work as a forensic accountant here in Denver, and until recently, I thought I had a pretty solid relationship with my family. I've always been the responsible one. You know, the daughter who paid off her student loans early, bought her own house, and somehow became the family's unofficial financial advisor. My parents have been on my credit cards for years because of their temporary money troubles that started during the 2008 crisis and just never really ended. Part 1. The thing about being the family's financial backbone is that you get really good at reading between the lines of every expense report, every credit card statement, every small favor request. So when my parents started acting weird around me, avoiding eye contact, cutting phone calls short, making excuses to skip our weekly dinners, my professional instincts kicked in hard. I'd been noticing some unusual charges on the cards I'd added them to. Nothing crazy, but definitely more than their usual grocery runs and gas fill-ups. There were charges at a fancy catering company, a high-end flower shop, and what looked like payments to a wedding venue. When I asked my mom about it, she got this panicked look and mumbled something about helping the neighbors with an event. My dad, never the best liar, just nodded along like a bobblehead and immediately changed the subject to how the weather's been lately. Classic deflection move. I see it all the time when clients are trying to hide financial impropriety, but I trusted them. God help me. I actually trusted them. The truth came out in the most innocent way possible. My brother Jake's daughter, Emma, my absolute favorite little human on this planet, came running up to me at what I thought was just a regular family barbecue. She was wearing this adorable little dress that looked suspiciously fancy for a backyard burger situation, and she had flowers in her hair. "Auntie Sarah," she squealed, throwing her tiny arms around my legs. "You missed the wedding. Daddy looked so handsome, and Mommy cried happy tears, and Grandma made the biggest cake ever." The entire backyard went silent, and I mean silent. My dad stopped flipping burgers mid-flip. My mom's laugh just died in her throat. My brother Jake went pale as his white polo shirt. Even my sister-in-law Michelle suddenly found her shoes incredibly fascinating. "What wedding, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice somehow staying calm despite the fact that my heart had just dropped into my stomach. Emma looked confused by the sudden adult weirdness surrounding us. "Daddy and Mommy's wedding last weekend. Grandma said it was going to be the best surprise, but then you weren't there, and—" "Emma, why don't you go play on the swings?" Jake interrupted, his voice tight with panic. But it was too late. The secret was out, and the damage was done. I stood there in my brother's backyard, wearing my casual barbecue clothes, looking at my family who were all dressed just a little too nice for what they'd told me was a simple get-together. The pieces started falling into place with the brutal efficiency I usually reserve for unraveling corporate fraud cases. The catering charges, the flower shop, the venue payments, the new clothes I'd noticed my parents wearing lately, the way everyone had been walking on eggshells around me for weeks. My brother had gotten remarried. To the same woman, sure, but they'd planned an entire wedding ceremony, invited the whole extended family, and deliberately excluded me. And they'd used my money to pay for it. "Sarah?" my mother started, reaching out like she was approaching a wounded animal. I held up my hand. "Don't." The forensic accountant in me was already running calculations. Rough estimate based on the charges I'd seen. Somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. For a wedding I wasn't invited to. Paid for with credit cards that I was legally responsible for. "We can explain," Jake said, but his voice lacked any real conviction. "Oh, I'm sure you can." I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my banking app. "Let me guess. You thought I'd be too busy with work to really enjoy a family celebration? Or maybe you figured I'd just bring down the mood with my intensity? That's what Michelle called it last Christmas, right? My intensity." The silence stretched on. Emma had run off to play, blissfully unaware that she'd just dropped a nuclear bomb on our family dynamics. "Sarah, please," my mother tried again. "We were going to tell you." "When?" I snapped, my professional composure finally cracking. "When exactly were you planning to tell me that you'd spent thousands of my dollars on a party I wasn't welcome at? Before or after the credit card bill came in?" My dad finally found his voice. "It wasn't like that. We just..." Michelle's family was already planning something small, and we thought, you thought you'd lie to me, use my money, and hope I'd never find out. I was scrolling through transactions now, adding up the real damage. $12,467. That's what my exclusion from this family cost me. Jake stepped forward. We'll pay you back. With what money, Jake? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The same money you've been borrowing from me for the past 3 years? The same money that you promised you were using for Emma's daycare and your mortgage? The thing about being a forensic accountant is that you develop a very specific skill set. You learn how to follow money trails, how to spot patterns, and most importantly, how to stay calm when everyone around you is lying. But this wasn't a case file. This was my family, and they had just shown me exactly how much I meant to them. I looked around at their faces, guilt, shame, defiance, and just a touch of resentment that I was making such a big deal and out of their deception. That resentment was what sealed it for me. They weren't sorry they'd lied. They were sorry they'd been caught. I need to go, I said, pocketing my phone. Sarah, wait, my mother called after me. But I was already walking toward my car, my mind shifting from hurt family member to the cold, calculating professional I'd trained myself to be. They'd made a choice. They'd chosen to exclude me while using my financial support. They'd chosen deception over honesty. Now I was going to show them what choices looked like when I made them. As I drove home, I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I was planning. And for the first time in years, my family was about to learn that I hadn't become successful by being naive or forgiving. They wanted to treat me like an ATM instead of a family member. Fine. But ATMs have terms and conditions, and they were about to learn what happens when you violate them. I spent the drive home doing what I do best, analyzing data and planning strategy. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a complete action plan formulated. The hurt was still there, burning in my chest like acid, but I'd compartmentalized it. Right now, I needed to think like the forensic accountant who'd helped the FBI unravel a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, not like the daughter who'd just discovered her family saw her as nothing more than a convenient funding source. The first thing I did was pour myself a glass of wine, a nice Pinot Grigio that cost more than my parents typically spent on groceries in a week, and spread out every credit card statement from the past 6 months across my dining room table. I had 3 cards that my parents were authorized users on, originally set up to help them through what they'd called a rough patch after my dad's hours got cut back in 2019. That rough patch, apparently, had evolved into a permanent lifestyle subsidy, one that they felt comfortable enough with to spend my money on a wedding they deliberately excluded me from. I started highlighting charges in different colors. Yellow for legitimate expenses I'd agreed to cover, groceries, gas, their prescription medications. Blue for questionable purchases that I'd never bothered to ask about because I trusted them, and red for the wedding-related expenses that had funded my own exclusion. The red ink told a story that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just the obvious charges like Bella Vista Catering and Eternal Bloom's Florist. There were smaller, more personal betrayals hidden in the statements. A charge at David's bridal from 3 months ago. Apparently Michelle had needed a new dress. And guess who'd unknowingly paid for it? Multiple trips to the local bakery where they'd obviously been doing cake tastings. Even a charge at a photography studio. They'd been planning this for months. Months of lying to my face while using my money to pay for a celebration I wasn't invited to. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was a charge from 2 weeks ago at a store I recognized. The fancy boutique where my mother loves to shop but can never afford. $347 for what was undoubtedly her mother-of-the-groom outfit. She'd bought a special dress for my brother's wedding using my credit card, then looked me in the eye the next day when I called to check on her and asked how her week was going. "Oh, nothing special," she'd said. "Just the usual routine." I set down my wine glass harder than necessary and reached for my laptop. Time to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. My parents weren't sophisticated about money. That's why they'd needed my help in the first place. They used their debit card for most purchases and only used my credit cards for what they considered big expenses. What they didn't realize was that I had access to every transaction in real time, complete with merchant details and spending patterns. Over the past 6 months, they'd spent $18,337 of my money. I'd been tracking the grocery and gas expenses, mentally categorizing them as my contribution to helping them stay afloat. But now, looking at the data with fresh eyes, I could see the pattern I'd been willfully ignoring. restaurant charges that increased dramatically whenever Jake and Michelle were in town, shopping sprees that coincided with family birthdays I somehow never heard about until after the fact. And yes, thousands of dollars in wedding expenses for an event they'd planned specifically without me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. In my professional life, this would be called embezzlement. When someone uses company credit cards for personal expenses that the company hasn't authorized, especially while hiding those expenses, it's fraud. The intent to deceive is what makes it criminal rather than just unethical. But this was my family. The same family who'd taught me the value of hard work and integrity. The same parents who'd sacrificed to send me to college, who'd been so proud when I'd landed my first job at the accounting firm. The same parents who'd apparently decided that my feelings and my inclusion in family events were worth less than their desire to avoid awkward conversations with my sister-in-law. I pulled up my online banking and stared at the account management options. Each credit card had a section for authorized users. 3 clicks. And I could remove my parents from all of them. 3 more clicks. And I could cancel the cards entirely, leaving them scrambled to figure out how to pay for their groceries and gas. But that felt too simple. Too clean. They'd had months to plan their deception. Months to figure out how to celebrate my brother's marriage while erasing me from the equation. I wasn't going to give them the luxury of a quick, straightforward consequence. My phone started ringing. Jake's name appeared on the screen, probably calling to explain or to ask me not to overreact. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately deleted the message without listening to it. He'd had his chance to explain before he'd spent my money on a party I wasn't invited to. Instead, I opened my laptop and started a spreadsheet. If they wanted to treat this like a business transaction, I'd treat it like a business transaction. Column 1, date. Column 2, merchant. Column 3, amount. Column 4, category. Column 5, authorization status. Because I sure as hell hadn't authorized wedding expenses. By midnight, I had a comprehensive audit of the past 2 years of charges. The total was staggering. $43,891. Nearly $44,000 of my money, spent on everything from their vacation to Branson last spring that they'd somehow forgotten to mention, to what appeared to be a new living room set. I'd been subsidizing their entire lifestyle while living in my modest 3-bedroom house, driving my practical Honda Civic, and brown bagging my lunch to work most days because I was being responsible with my money. They'd been living better than I was, on my dime, while excluding me from family events. I poured another glass of wine and started drafting an email. Not to my family. They'd lost the right to direct communication when they decided to lie to me for months. No, this email was going to my attorney, Rebecca Chen, who'd helped me buy my house and set up my LLC. Rebecca, I typed, I need to schedule a consultation regarding unauthorized use of credit cards by authorized users, and the legal options available for recovering fraudulent charges. This is time-sensitive and involves family members, so discretion is important. Are you available this week? I hit send before I could second-guess myself. This wasn't about the money. I could afford the loss, even if it stung. This was about the principle. This was about the fact that they'd looked at me and decided I was worth less than their desire to avoid an uncomfortable conversation with Michelle about including me. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I stared at her contact photo, a smiling selfie we'd taken at last Christmas when everything still seemed normal, and felt something cold settle in my chest where the hurt used to be. I declined the call and immediately opened my banking app. First, I removed my parents as authorized users from all 3 credit cards. The system asked if I was sure, warning me that they'd lose access immediately. I clicked yes without hesitation. Then I called each credit card company's fraud department. Hi, I need to report unauthorized charges by former authorized users, I said to each representative. I have documentation showing they used my cards for personal expenses that I didn't approve, including deliberately excluding me from events they were funding with my money. Each company was surprisingly helpful. Apparently, family financial fraud is more common than I'd realized. They flagged the wedding-related charges for investigation and issued me new cards with different numbers. My parents on cards would be declined if they tried to use them again. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I opened a new document on my computer and started typing a detailed timeline of events, complete with supporting documentation. Every charge, every lie, every time they'd looked me in the eye and pretended everything was normal while planning their deception. Because here's the thing about being a forensic accountant. I don't just find the fraud. I build airtight cases that hold up in court. I document everything. cross-reference all the evidence, and present findings that are impossible to dispute. And my family had just given me the most personal case of my career. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Sarah, please call me back. We can work this out." It wasn't personal. I stared at that message for a long moment. It wasn't personal. Excluding me from his wedding while using my money to pay for it wasn't personal. I texted back, "Check your credit cards. Then we'll talk about what's personal." Within minutes, my phone was ringing constantly. Jake, my mother, my father, even Michelle. I silenced all of them and poured myself a third glass of wine. Tomorrow, I'd start implementing phase 2 of my plan. Tonight, I was going to enjoy the first peaceful evening I'd had in months, knowing that I was finally done being my family's secret ATM. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd excluded me from their celebration, but they'd included me in paying for it. Now they were about to learn what real exclusion felt like. And unlike their wedding planning, I wasn't going to hide what I was doing. I was going to be completely transparent about my actions and my reasons. They'd taught me the importance of integrity, after all. Time to show them what that actually looked like. I raised my wine glass to the empty dining room. "Here's to family," I said aloud, and to learning what that word actually means. My laptop chimed with Rebecca's reply. "Can you come in Thursday at 10 a.m.? And Sarah, document everything. Whatever's happening, you're going to want a paper trail." I smiled for the first time since Emma's innocent revelation had shattered my world. Rebecca had no idea how thorough my documentation was about to become. Phase 2 was going to be very interesting indeed. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually makes me feel optimistic about life. Today, it felt like a perfect backdrop for the systematic dismantling of my family's financial security. I'd slept better than I had in weeks, probably because for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of everyone else's problems on my shoulders. Rebecca's office sits in one of those sleek downtown buildings that screams expensive legal advice, but she's worth every penny. She'd helped me navigate the purchase of my house when the seller tried to back out at the last minute, and she'd been instrumental in setting up the LLC that handles my consulting work. More importantly, she doesn't sugarcoat anything, which I was definitely going to need today. "Sarah," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk, "you look like someone who's about to declare war." "Close," I replied, setting down my meticulously organized folder of evidence. "I'm about to declare independence." I laid out the entire situation for her, starting with the innocent comment from my niece and working through the financial documentation I'd compiled. Rebecca's expression grew more serious with each detail, and by the time I finished, she was leaning back in her chair with the look she gets when she's calculating damages. $43,891, she said, flipping through my spreadsheets. Over 2 years, and the wedding expenses alone were $12,467 for an event I wasn't invited to, planned and paid for while they lied to my face for months. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Legally speaking, you have several options. The credit card companies will likely reverse the charges you've disputed, especially the wedding-related ones, since you can prove you weren't even invited. That's clear, unauthorized use. But," I could hear the "ad but e" coming, "but pursuing criminal charges against your parents would be complicated, emotionally and practically. However," she continued, holding up a finger, "there are other ways to handle this that might be more satisfying." She pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out a strategy that was so elegant it almost made me laugh. Civil demand letters, documentation for tax purposes, and what I like to call legitimate business consequences. We're going to make this expensive for them in ways they never saw coming. The first step was simple: a formal demand letter for full restitution, sent via certified mail. Not because I expected them to suddenly have $43,000 lying around, but because it would create a legal paper trail and force them to acknowledge, in writing, what they'd done. The beauty of this approach, Rebecca explained, is that we're not being vindictive. We're being thorough. Every action we take will be completely justified and legally sound. The second step was more complex. Since my parents had used my credit cards for personal expenses that I could prove I hadn't authorized, I could report those charges as fraudulent. The credit card companies would investigate, reverse the charges, and send the debt back to my parents directly. They'll be responsible for paying back every penny, Rebecca said, but now it'll be at whatever interest rate the credit card companies charge for fraudulent debt recovery, usually somewhere around 29%. But the third step was where Rebecca's brilliance really showed. "You mentioned your father works part-time at that hardware store. And your mother does bookkeeping for a few small businesses under the table. Yeah, they've been doing cash-only work to avoid reporting it properly. Rebecca smiled in a way that would have terrified me if I were on the wrong side of her legal expertise. Well, they're about to learn about something called constructive receipt of income. When someone uses credit that they're not legally responsible for but benefits from the purchases, that can be considered taxable income. She started pulling forms from her desk drawer. We're going to file a 1099 for every dollar they spent on non-essential items. Vacations, restaurant meals, that living room set, the wedding expenses, all of it counts as income they received but didn't report. I felt my jaw drop. You mean, they're going to owe back taxes, plus penalties and interest, on thousands of dollars of unreported income. The IRS doesn't care if it was borrowed money. They used it, they benefited from it, and they didn't report it. The math was staggering. Between the fraudulent debt recovery and the tax implications, my parents were looking at owing somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 to various creditors and government agencies. Money they definitely didn't have. There's one more thing, Rebecca said, her expression growing serious. Your brother's business? I'd mentioned that Jake ran a small landscaping company, mostly residential work that he'd built up over the past 5 years. It wasn't hugely profitable, but it kept him and Michelle comfortable, especially with my secret subsidies covering their personal expenses. If he knew about the fraudulent charges and benefited from them, like having his wedding paid for with unauthorized credit, he could be considered complicit, especially if we can prove he helped plan the deception. She slid a document across the desk. This is a formal notice of potential civil action. It doesn't commit you to anything, but it puts him on notice that his business assets could be at risk if this goes to court. I stared at the legal document, feeling the weight of what I was about to unleash. This wasn't just about getting my money back anymore. This was about dismantling the entire financial structure that had allowed my family to live comfortably while treating me like a disposable ATM. How long? I asked quietly, before all this hits them. The credit card reversals will start within a week. The demand letter will arrive Monday. The tax forms. Well, those take a few weeks to process. But once the IRS gets involved, things move pretty quickly. I signed every document she put in front of me, authorized every action she recommended, and wrote a check for her retainer that was probably more than my parents spent on groceries in 3 months. As I walked back to my car, my phone started buzzing with yet another call from Jake. This time, I answered. "Sarah, thank God," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk. Our cards got declined at the grocery store yesterday, and Michelle is freaking out." "Really?" I kept my voice neutral. "That's weird. Did you call the credit card company?" "They said the cards were canceled due to fraudulent activity." "Sarah, please. Whatever's going on, we can fix this. Emma keeps asking why everyone's upset, and Michelle's been crying since yesterday." I stopped walking and leaned against my car. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Of course, anything." "When you were planning your wedding, at what point did you decide not to invite me?" The silence stretched for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't like that. "When, Jake? Was it when you booked the venue? When you sent out invitations? When you ordered the flowers? Or was it right from the beginning, when you decided you wanted a family celebration that didn't include your sister?" Michelle thought. "She said you'd probably be too busy with work anyway, and you don't really like big parties. So you made that decision for me. You decided I wouldn't want to celebrate my brother's wedding, and then you used my money to pay for the celebration I wasn't allowed to attend." "Sarah, please." "No, Jake, you please explain to me how you justified spending $12,000 of my money on a party I wasn't invited to? You please tell me how you looked at me every week for months, knowing you were lying to my face. You please help me understand why I should trust you with anything ever again." I could hear him crying now, which should have made me feel guilty. Instead, it just made me angry. Where were these tears when he was planning his secret wedding? Where was this remorse when he was spending my money on flowers and cake for everyone except me? "What do you want?" he asked finally. "What can we do to fix this?" "You can't fix it, Jake. You can't uninvite me from your wedding. You can't unexpend my money. You can't untell the lies you've been telling me for months. But we can pay you back." "With what money? The money you don't have? The same money you've been borrowing from me for 3 years? The money you're going to need for lawyers when the credit card companies come after you for fraud?" Another long silence. What are you talking about? Check your mail on Monday? And Jake? You might want to start keeping better records of your business income. The IRS is very interested in people who live beyond their reported means. I hung up before he could respond and immediately blocked his number. Then I blocked my parents' numbers too. If they wanted to communicate with me, they could do it through Rebecca. The drive home felt different somehow, lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of everyone else's financial problems. I wasn't wondering how much this month's family emergency was going to cost me. I wasn't making mental calculations about whether I could afford to help with whatever crisis would inevitably arise. I was free. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I ordered dinner from my favorite expensive restaurant and ate it while watching Netflix, without once checking my phone or worrying about family drama. I was halfway through a fantastic episode of a crime documentary when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see my mother standing on my porch, clutching a tissue and looking like she'd aged 10 years since the barbecue. Part of me wanted to ignore her, but curiosity won out. "Hi, Mom," I said, opening the door but not inviting her in. "Sarah, sweetheart, we need to talk." She looked past me into my house, clearly expecting to be invited inside. "We really don't, but if you want to say something, you can say it from there." Her face crumpled. "How can you be so cold? We're your family." "Really? Because family doesn't usually lie to each other for months while stealing money. Family doesn't usually plan elaborate celebrations while deliberately excluding each other. Family doesn't usually—" "It wasn't stealing," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Those were our cards too. You gave them to us?" I smiled, recognizing the deflection tactic I'd seen so many times in my professional life. "No, Mom, they were my cards, that I added you to as authorized users, to help with specific expenses that we'd agreed on. Groceries, gas, medical bills. Not vacations, not furniture, and definitely not weddings I wasn't invited to. We were going to tell you about the wedding." "When?" "After it was over. After you'd spent my money on it. After you'd had your celebration and I was just supposed to smile and pretend it was fine." She dabbed at her eyes with the tissue. "You don't understand how difficult this has been. Michelle's family has very strong opinions about guest lists. And they thought—" "Stop." I held up my hand. "Just stop. You're about to blame your daughter-in-law for the choices you made. You're about to tell me that you had no choice but to exclude me from my brother's wedding and lie to me about it for months." She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You and Dad are going to get a letter from my attorney on Monday. You're going to owe money to the credit card companies. You're going to owe money to the IRS. And you're going to figure out how to handle all of that without any help from me. Sarah, please, we can't afford—" "You should have thought about that before you decided to fund a wedding with my money. You should have thought about that before you chose Michelle's comfort over your daughter's inclusion in the family." I started to close the door, then stopped. "Oh, and Mom, don't come here again. If you want to communicate with me, you can do it through Rebecca Chen at Morrison & Associates. She's handling all my family-related business now." I closed the door and locked it, listening to her crying on my porch for a few minutes before she finally left. Through the window, I watched her walk slowly to her car, looking every bit like the woman who just realized that actions have consequences. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Probably Jake using Michelle's phone since I'd blocked his. "Sarah, please don't do this to our family. Emma keeps asking why Aunt Sarah doesn't love us anymore." I deleted the message without responding. If they wanted to explain to a 6-year-old why their aunt wasn't around anymore, they could start with the truth about how they'd treated her. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled back onto my couch. Tomorrow, Rebecca would file the paperwork that would officially start the process of recovering my money and holding my family accountable for their choices. They'd wanted to celebrate without me. Now they were going to face the consequences without me too. And for the first time in years, that felt exactly right. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my office reviewing a complex fraud case for a client when Rebecca called with the first update on what she'd started calling Operation Family Accountability. "Sarah, you need to hear this," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "The credit card companies moved faster than I expected. Your parents received their first demand letters yesterday, and your brother's business got served with a civil notice this morning." I leaned back in my chair, watching the city bustle below my office window. How much are we talking about? $68,400. Between the fraudulent charges, interest, penalties, and the tax implications we filed with the IRS. She paused for effect. And that's just the beginning. The credit card companies had been remarkably efficient once I'd provided them with documentation proving that my parents had used the cards for expenses I'd never authorized. The wedding charges were reversed immediately, leaving my parents responsible for paying back the full amount at the credit card company's fraud recovery interest rate of 29.99%. But the real masterpiece was the tax situation. When the IRS received the 1099 forms documenting all the unreported income my parents had received through their use of my credit cards, they'd triggered an automatic audit. My parents now owed not just the taxes on that unreported income, but penalties for failing to report it plus interest dating back to when they should have claimed it. There's more, Rebecca continued. Your brother's landscaping business is in serious trouble. Apparently, when word got out about the civil action, 3 of his biggest clients canceled their contracts. People don't like working with businesses that have legal problems. I felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly. Jake had made his choices. He'd decided that his wife's comfort was more important than his sister's feelings, and that my money was his to spend however he saw fit. Now he was learning that choices have consequences. Have any of them tried to contact you directly? My mother showed up at my house again last Friday. I called the police and filed a trespassing report. My attorney sent them all a formal cease and desist letter, so any further contact has to go through you. Rebecca laughed. I love clients who follow instructions. Speaking of which, I have some interesting news about your sister-in-law's family. This was unexpected. What about them? Well, it turns out that Michelle's parents are quite well off. Like, really well off. Her father owns 3 car dealerships, and her mother is a partner in a successful real estate firm. They could have easily paid for the wedding themselves. The implications hit me like a physical blow. So they chose to use my money instead. It looks that way, which makes the exclusion even more deliberate. They had other options for funding, but they chose to use yours while keeping you out of the celebration. I sat in silence for a moment, processing this new information. It wasn't just that they'd excluded me from Jake's wedding. It wasn't just that they'd used my money to pay for it. They'd actively chosen to use my money instead of asking Michelle's wealthy parents, specifically so they could exclude me without financial consequences. Sarah, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Just processing. There's one more thing. Your parents have been telling people around town that you've had a breakdown and are acting irrationally due to work stress. Apparently, they're positioning themselves as the victims of your unreasonable demands. That did it. The last vestige of guilt I'd been carrying evaporated completely. They weren't just refusing to take responsibility for their actions. They were actively trying to damage my reputation to avoid accountability. Rebecca, I want to add defamation to our civil action, and I want to make sure everyone in town knows exactly why I cut them off. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already drafted a public statement that we can send to the local newspaper. It's factual, non-emotional, and completely destroys their narrative. That afternoon, I received the first phone call I'd accepted from a family member in 2 weeks. It wasn't from my parents or Jake. It was from my cousin Lisa, who lived 3 states away and had heard through the family grapevine that there was drama happening. Sarah, what the hell is going on? She said without preamble. I got a call from your mom crying about lawyers and credit cards, and something about you destroying the family and over a misunderstanding. I gave Lisa the full story, start to finish, including the financial documentation and the timeline of lies. By the end, she was silent for a long moment. Jesus Christ, Sarah. They really did that. They really did. And they used your money for the wedding you weren't invited to. $12,467 worth. Lisa let out a low whistle. You know what? Good for you. I always thought there was something weird about how comfortable they seemed financially when your dad's only working part-time. That conversation led to others. Apparently, my parents' version of events hadn't been as convincing to the extended family as they'd hoped. When people heard the actual facts, that I'd been financially supporting my parents for years, that they'd used my money for a wedding they'd deliberately excluded me from, and that they'd lied about it for months, the sympathy shifted dramatically. My Uncle Robert, Dad's brother, called me directly. Sarah, I want you to know that not everyone is buying their sob story. What they did was wrong, and you have every right to protect yourself. Thank you, Uncle Robert. I wasn't sure how the family would react. Honey, most of us have been wondering for years how your parents could afford their lifestyle on your dad's part-time income. Now we know, And frankly, a lot of us are disgusted. These conversations were both validating and heartbreaking. It felt good to have family members acknowledge that my parents' Ike's behavior was unacceptable, but it was painful to realize how many people had suspected I was being taken advantage of and hadn't said anything. The breaking point came 3 weeks after I'd filed the legal actions. I was having dinner at my favorite restaurant when Michelle appeared at my table, looking haggard and desperate. "Sarah, please, you have to stop this," she said, sitting down without being invited. "Jake's business is failing. Your parents are talking about bankruptcy, and Emma keeps asking why her family is falling apart." I set down my fork and looked at her calmly. "Hello, Michelle. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Don't be cold, please. I know you're angry, and maybe you have a right to be, but this has gone too far." "Has it? Because from where I'm sitting, this is exactly as far as it needed to go." She leaned forward desperately. "We can pay you back. It might take time, but we can make monthly payments, set up a plan." "With what money? The money Jake's losing because his clients don't trust him anymore. The money your parents apparently had all along but chose not to use for your wedding." Her face went pale. How did I find out that your parents could have easily paid for your wedding, but you all chose to use my money instead? Because I'm a forensic accountant, Michelle. Finding hidden assets and uncovering financial deception is literally what I do for a living. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. You and Jake made a deliberate choice to exclude me from your wedding while using my money to pay for it, even though you had other options. You chose deception over honesty and convenience over family. Michelle started crying, which drew attention from other diners. "Please, Sarah. Emma doesn't understand why her aunt hates her family. She thinks she did something wrong." That hit harder than I wanted to admit. I don't hate Emma. I don't hate any of you. But I'm done being treated like an ATM instead of a family member. We never meant— Yes, you did. You absolutely meant it. You meant to exclude me. You meant to use my money. You meant to lie to me about it. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught. I signaled for the check, but Michelle wasn't done. "What's it going to take, Sarah? What do you want from us?" I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd been part of our family for years, who'd benefited from my financial support while advocating for my exclusion from family events. "I want you to tell Emma the truth," I said finally. "I want you to explain to her that sometimes adults make choices that hurt people they're supposed to love, and that when people get hurt badly enough, they have to protect themselves." She's 6 years old. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you chose to create a situation that would hurt her. You made this mess, Michelle. You figure out how to explain it to your daughter. I paid my check and stood to leave, but Michelle grabbed my arm. "Sarah, please. Jake talks about you all the time. He misses his sister. Your parents are falling apart. Can't we find a way to fix this?" I gently removed her hand from my arm. "You can't fix broken trust, Michelle. You can't unspend money that wasn't yours. You can't uninvite someone from a wedding and then expect them to just get over it." I left her crying at the table, and for the first time since this whole situation started, I felt something like peace. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just peace. I'd said what needed to be said, and I was done carrying the emotional weight of their choices. The final chapter of this saga came 6 weeks later, when Rebecca called with news that brought everything full circle. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," she said, excitement clear in her voice. "Your parents just filed for bankruptcy protection." "Really? Really?" And here's the beautiful part. Bankruptcy doesn't discharge debts incurred through fraud. So even if they get protection from their other creditors, they still owe you the full amount, plus interest. And Jake's business? Closed as of yesterday. Apparently, he couldn't keep up with the civil settlement payments and the loss of clients. Michelle filed for divorce this morning. I sat down heavily in my chair. I'd expected consequences, but this was more complete than I'd imagined. What about Emma? She'll be fine. Michelle's moving back in with her parents, the ones with the 3 car dealerships. And Jake's looking for work as an employee landscaper instead of running his own business. The irony was perfect. Michelle was going back to the family money that could have paid for their wedding in the first place, if they hadn't been so determined to use mine while excluding me. "There's one more thing," Rebecca continued. "Your parents want to meet. They're ready to acknowledge what they did and apologize formally." I thought about it for a moment. "Set it up for next week." "But Rebecca, you're going to be there, and this meeting is being recorded." The meeting took place in Rebecca's conference room on a gray Thursday morning. My parents looked like they'd aged years in the past 2 months. My father's face was gaunt, and my mother's hands shook as she clutched her purse. "Sarah," my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we want you to know how sorry we are." "Sorry for what?" "Specifically," I asked. I wasn't going to make this easy for them. My father cleared his throat. "We're sorry for lying to you about the wedding. We're sorry for using your money without permission. We're sorry for excluding you from family events while taking your financial support. And we're sorry for telling people you were having a breakdown," my mother added. That was wrong. I looked at them across the conference table, these people who'd raised me and taught me right from wrong, and felt something like pity. "And do you understand why I had to do this? You had to protect yourself," my father said quietly. "We put you in an impossible position, and we took advantage of your generosity. We understand if you can never forgive us," my mother added. "But we needed you to know that we understand what we did was wrong." I sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between us. I loved you both so much that I was willing to sacrifice my own financial security to help you. And you loved me so little that you were willing to exclude me from important family events while spending my money on them. Both of them started crying then, which should have felt like vindication. Instead, it just felt sad. "The bankruptcy will protect you from most of your creditors," I continued, "but not from the debt you owe me. That's going to follow you for the rest of your lives, and I want you to remember every month when you make that payment what it cost you to treat your daughter like an ATM." I stood up and gathered my purse. "Rebecca will handle all future communications. Don't contact me directly. Don't come to my house, and don't expect me at any family gatherings until I decide I'm ready, if I ever am." As I reached the door, my mother called out, "Sarah, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive us?" I turned back to look at them one last time. "I don't know, Mom. But I do know that forgiveness isn't the same thing as trust, and trust is something you build over years and destroy in moments. You destroyed 29 years of trust in one conversation with a 6-year-old. What can we do to earn it back?" I thought about that for a moment. Stop asking what you can do for me, and start thinking about what kind of people you want to be. The parents who raised me would never have done what you did. Maybe start by figuring out who you became and why. I left them sitting in that conference room and walked out into the autumn sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in years. My phone was already buzzing with work calls, and I had a fraud case to review that afternoon. My life was full of purpose and challenge and success that I'd earned through my own efforts. For the first time in my adult life, it was also full of boundaries. Real boundaries. Enforced with legal documents and financial consequences. No more last-minute emergencies that required my bailout. No more family events that I funded but wasn't welcome at. No more lies disguised as protection of my feelings. 6 months later, I got a card in the mail from Emma. Inside, in her careful 6-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "Dear Aunt Sarah, I miss you. Mommy says adults sometimes make mistakes that hurt people. I hope someday you can come to my birthday party again. Love, Emma." I put the card on my refrigerator and cried for the first time since this whole mess started. Not for my parents, or for Jake and Michelle, or even for myself. I cried for Emma, who was learning too young that the adults she trusted could make choices that shattered the world she thought she understood. But I also smiled, because Emma was learning something else important. That people don't have to accept being treated badly, even by family. That boundaries matter. That actions have consequences. Those were lessons that would serve her well as she grew up. And maybe, if I was very lucky, they were lessons she'd learned in time to avoid making the same mistakes her parents and grandparents had made. As for me, I was finally free to build the life I wanted, surrounded by people who valued me for more than my bank account. And if my family ever figured out how to be the people they claimed to be, maybe there would be room for them in that life again. But that was their choice to make. I'd already made mine. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who feel most entitled to take advantage of that love. Family doesn't get a free pass to treat you badly just because you share DNA. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is show people the real consequences of their choices. To anyone dealing with financial manipulation from family members, document everything, protect yourself legally, and remember that you're not responsible for fixing problems you didn't create. You deserve better than being someone's convenient ATM. Your worth isn't measured by what you can provide for others. It's measured by how you value yourself. Thanks for reading. If you want to hear more stories about boundaries, consequences, and standing up for yourself? Let me know in the comments below.